So, Power Rangers, the show, is infamous for many reasons. One of which being the absolutely insane production life, one that we're still learning about today with the show officially ending and getting more and more information from the actors. But probably the most infamous of behind-the-scenes drama, one that even the general audience probably has a vague idea of if you were to just ask someone off the street, comes from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Season 2's production, where Austin St. John, who played Jason the Red Ranger, Thuy Trang, who played Trini the Yellow Ranger, and Walter Jones, who played Zack the Black Ranger, walked off set due to pay disputes with Saban and thus had to be replaced by Steve Cardenas, who played Rocky, Karen Ashley, who played Aisha, and Johnny Young Bosch, who played Adam. While the show did as best as it could with the out-of-nowhere transition between actors and characters, it was still a very rough period of trying to phase out 3 major characters who suddenly couldn't appear anymore and phase in 3 new characters. After an awkward few episodes of Jason, Zack, and Trini being away on scuba trips, reusing footage, and bad dubbing, the show finally explained that the 3 were chosen to be sent to a peace conference in Switzerland, leading to the promotion of the 3 newbies, and things proceeded as normal. As for the 3 that left, they were basically out of sight, out of mind, though Jason would return as the Gold Ranger in Zeo, just as himself in the Turbo movie, and then as Red in Wild Force's Forever Red special and Beast Morphers Grid Connection special. Zack would return as the Black Ranger for the 30-year anniversary special Once and Always, and unfortunately with Thuy Trang's passing back in 2001, Trini herself never appears out of suit again, with her character officially being killed off in Once and Always, and her Yellow Ranger position being succeeded by her daughter Min. So that's all show drama, because the show is vulnerable to the whims of its actors. When the actors want to leave, the show has to accommodate them leaving. But now we're talking about comic books. And hey, maybe Jason, Zack, and Trini don't have to be shipped off to a peace conference was a possibility that came up as soon as the Boom Power Rangers comics were announced. And it ended up being taken in, multiple ways, with the various continuities featured in different series. The first was in the Kim-centered miniseries Pink, which, while not in canon with the 2016 main series, more or less followed the route of the show. Jason does not show up in the book. In universe, he's stated to be off on his own mission, but out of universe, the reasoning was the authors didn't want him taking Kim's leadership position from her. But Zack and Trini are still in Switzerland following the conference and take up the powers one more time to help Kim on her mission. And as a bonus, Trini and Zack had become an official couple in the meantime. Another tackling of the peace conference comes in Amy Jo Johnson's miniseries The Return, that's set in an alternate timeline where the original MMPRs keep their powers throughout their whole lives. This is achieved by more or less following the timeline of the show up until the peace conference, where instead of giving up their powers, the trio just agree to teleport between Switzerland and Angel Grove whenever they are needed. Finally, the 2016 main series, the subject of this video, when it's time for Jason, Zack, and Trini to go to the peace conference, it turns out it was all just a cover for their actual mission, which was to become new intergalactic Power Rangers chosen by a morphing grid god following an evil alternate Tommy Oliver's failed plan to take over the multiverse and shattering the grid in the process. So, the least complicated path. So, in general, the Omega Rangers are kind of unique in that they're one of the few original Boom teams to not follow the MMPR color scheme, being made up of red, yellow, black, blue, and gold, though gold was lost back in the events of the original team, and thus the modern team is only made up of the first 4. Though, funnily enough, according to the author of the Death Ranger origin book, there was going to be an additional 6th Ranger, but they ended up cut for time and space reasons, and I don't think we ever got confirmation as to what color they were. They have an alchemy/element theme, with red representing fire, yellow representing earth, black representing wind, blue representing water, and gold representing sun, and later coming to represent death as the powers of the Death Ranger. They have their own robot buddy, G, and work on an abandoned Morphin Master colony planet named Safe Haven. For a very, very brief overview of the 2016 series Omega timeline, because we'll be getting more into detail on it later, after the events of Shattered Grid and the evil alternate universe Tommy Lord Draken's shenanigans, the morphing grid is cracked, and excess energy is basically shooting out and zapping random folks around the universe with power they can't control. Jason, Zack, and Trini are recruited by the Blue Emissary, one of the guardians of the Morphin Grid, to find and round up these empowered individuals and bring them to Safe Haven, where they can be safe and others can be safe from them. Amiable empowered are free to live peacefully on Safe Haven, but violent ones are put in space dumpsters and kept in a big safe. Obviously, Jason is red, Zack is black, and Trini is yellow, but they end up recruiting one of the empowered named Kia as blue. Kia eventually turns on the team after learning how her powers came to be and kills the Blue Emissary, so she gets the boot and her blue powers eventually go to a previously empowered alien tiger named Yale. The empowered lose their excess powers thanks to the actions of alternate universe Kimberly Ranger Slayer and her friends the Solar Rangers, but folks who don't want to or can't go home to their old planet stay on Safe Haven. The Omegas decide to upgrade their services into helping the entire universe in whatever people might need. After a whole thing where the red in-space ranger Andros, yes, that Andros, frees the sealed away gold Omega Ranger Spark the Death Ranger, and they turn the entire team into zombies, Jason gets cut off from his red powers and gives them to Trini, her yellow powers going to an alien kid picked up along the way named Kevor. The 2016 series ends on this Omega team. Something worth noting is that we never actually get a real origin story for these powers or the legacy of the Omegas in general. The modern stories refer to the powers as ancient, and the Omegas are known by beings such as Zordon, Zed, and the Imperials, basically dark sides of the emissaries. We'll get to those. The Gold Morpher is considered a legendary artifact whose story is told to children, but when we, the readers, finally get to see the original Omegas via the story of the Gold Morpher, the only thing really established is a group of regular guys who spend their time going after galactic monsters and bottling them up, not unlike the modern Omega's original mission of going after empowered and bottling them up. There's no discussion as to who originally made the powers, or who made the Zords, or who gave them this mission, or how these guys were chosen to be Rangers in the first place, especially worth noting as they're all different species of alien, with Spark the Gold Ranger outright talking about how they had to leave their home planet to do this, so it's safe to assume someone had to collect them somehow. G worked with the original team, but they don't offer any insight on who started this campaign. We also get no answer as to why the Omega powers were dormant until they were found again by the Blue Emissary. Reading between the lines, you get the implication that there were no other Omegas between the originals and Jason, Zack, and Trini, but again, we get no answers as to what happened to the originals outside of Spark, who, as we know, became the Death Ranger and got sealed away by their own team. This isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's just odd to leave that lore untouched, especially considering how important the Omegas and their operation became to the back half of the 2016 series. Honestly, when they became major characters, I assumed Blue Emissary had simply made the Omega powers, something that actually would have fit with the later reveal that Blue's previous identity was the creator of Ranger powers in general, but I digress. Heck, as I said, the Death Rangers book also establishes that G worked with the first Omegas, and this is never discussed with them in the modern stories. In universe, it's explained that G has a tendency to wipe their memories as a trauma response, which is an interesting character choice for a robot, but ultimately nothing is really done with this, especially when in the finale even, they essentially die for good when the evil Alpha 5 prototype, Alpha 1, takes over their body and then Dark Spectre kills him, something none of the Rangers really seem to notice or even wonder about, which is sad. But at the same time, it kind of makes sense that the origins of the Omega powers wouldn't really be discussed, because at the end of the day, the Omega powers exist for one reason only: to keep Jason, Zack, and Trini as Rangers, and thus a reason for them to stay in the story, even after moving on to the MMPR V2 team of Tommy, Kim, Billy, Rocky, Adam, and Aisha, which on paper, yes, is very cool. But the introduction of these three as new Rangers undoubtedly changed the trajectory of the 2016 series, because suddenly the focus of the stories began to shift from the more grounded stories of the MMPRs on Earth to the lore-expanding space adventures of the Omegas, which put more precedence on them and OCs rather than the MMPRs still on Earth. The MMPRs and their stories suddenly began being treated as lesser, with the narrative surrounding the Omegas being the ones driving the greater plot, to the point where the Omegas get framed as basically the superior Rangers over the MMPRs, both in strength and ideals, basically described by the author as the Omegas going off to college and changing versus the MMPRs still being hometown high schoolers and staying the same. And this shift specifically began with the Necessary Evil event, which was basically the beginning of the MMPR Season 2 era of the comics. Besides the Omegas debuting there, this was also the official debut of Lord Zed as the main villain, and the MMPR V2 team of White Ranger Tommy, and Rocky as red, Adam as black, and Aisha as yellow. When Tommy is taken out by Zed's hired mercenary Dane, Kim, who still thinks the Omegas are simply in Switzerland as they have to keep their true mission secret to protect the stability of the timeline after it was reconstructed via Shattered Grid's ending. Though as the stories go along, we'll see this concept gets dropped. She leaves a voicemail on Trini's phone venting her concerns about how much she misses her old friends, basically implying that she doesn't know if they'll make it out of the next fight alive due to how strong their new enemies are versus how inexperienced the new team is, and thus feels that Jason, Zach, and Trini abandoned them when they were truly needed. The Omegas decide to come back and help defeat Dane, but still worried about how the MMPRs are faring without them, take it a step further and lay siege to the moon itself, defeating Zed in battle and stuffing him in a space dumpster. Now, for those who didn't follow the comics at the time, this was a big deal back when the issue came out. There was a lot of criticism and discussion over if this was the right thing for the books to do, and it's easy to see why. People had been waiting years for Zed to make his official debut as the main series head villain, and the book, previously taking a more serious route with Rita, had people hopeful that Zed would get the same treatment, especially after he infamously had to get toned down from scary and imposing in his debut in the original show to a more comedic figure at the request of concerned parents. And what happens is 5 issues into his introduction, he gets his palace invaded, he gets beaten up, and he gets put in a dumpster, where he'll stay for the rest of the event because we need him out of the way so the actual main villain of the event, the Blue Omega Ranger Kia, can take center stage. Besides how this immediately shifts everything over in favor of the Omegas, a precursor of things to come, this will unfortunately kickstart the series' trend of using Zed as a punching bag in order to establish the new villains or new Rangers as super powerful, something he shares with White Ranger Tommy, who had previously gotten beaten up in the same event by Dane, who then gets taken out by the Omegas. While I do think this scene, in the interest of fairness, attempts to make it clear that Zed is extremely powerful and needed a hit as heavy as a punch from the Omega Red Zord in order to take him out, the point still stands that, well, the Omegas defeated Zed. They marched up to his house and defeated him and threw him in the same prison that he sentenced Rita to in his mutiny. In his debut arc is the main villain. As a point of comparison, I need people to know that in the same amount of issues back in the first arc of the comics, Rita had succeeded in her plan of bringing in the Black Dragon and subjugating the command center, taking out Zordon and scattering the Rangers. And Zed is supposed to be her boss. It didn't have to happen this way. The point of the scene ultimately was to be an excuse for the MMPRs and Omegas to be in the same room so Kia could see Tommy, realize he's a Draken counterpart, freak out, and start her road to darkness. And then Zed stays out of the way so she can be the main villain of the arc, which could have happened without defeating Zed. Zed could have defeated the Omegas and the MMPRs had to rescue them. Zed could have decided to stay out of the upcoming conflict for his own amusement, or to give the Omegas some dignity, has to go into one of his rejuvenating coma things to recover from the battle. There was no narrative reason for Zed to specifically have been beaten and shoved in a dumpster, forever ruining his place as MMPR's so-called main villain. There was only really one way for Zed to jump back from this, and that would be for him to hit the Omegas back just as hard as they hit him, maybe razing Safe Haven to the ground as soon as Dane frees him from the dumpster at the end of the event. But this doesn't happen. He just kinda quietly goes back home, and when he does commit some kind of action in revenge, creating a magical dome to trap Angel Grove in, the plot ultimately goes nowhere, and it isn't even targeting the Omegas. He says it's revenge against the Rangers for invading his home, but the MMPRs didn't do that, and really, that troubles me more than Zed getting defeated. Obviously, the villain is going to get defeated on a regular basis. It's part and parcel of the Power Rangers formula. But what makes the villain work is how they react to this loss, and Zed doesn't react, not in a way that actually affects the Omegas, because ultimately we'll learn the Omegas are immune to things such as consequences, no matter how bad they get and how much their actions hurt others, because the point of their stories is that they're the absolute peak of Power Rangers, and others can't even hope to compare to them. Which makes it worse when you think about how the comics made a conscious choice to skip to the Season 2 timeline rather than sticking with the originals for as long as they could. But despite this, does not allow the introduced Season 2 elements of the show to really shine. First of all, the Omega's own successors, Aisha, Rocky, and Adam. Something else I'll give Necessary Evil is that there was at least an attempt at acknowledging the Stone Canyon Trio's feelings at being considered second best to the Omegas, which we we supposedly resolved in the story by them being the ones to take down Dane at the end of the event, and thus proving their own worth as Rangers. But the problem is, when you have Jason, Zack, and Trini as being their own new super cool solo team, one that takes on huge universe-ending threats, a team that certain storylines outright say are more powerful than the MMPRs, the implication that the originals are superior to their replacements is always going to be there, no matter how much the characters try to say they aren't. Trini telling Aisha, no, you guys are great Rangers too, just feels condescending rather than validating. You guys are doing a great job on your little weenie hut juniors of a planet while we go off and act responsible for the entire universe because we were chosen by a morphing grid god. Sure, we felt you were so inept that we decided to come down and beat your villain for you, but that doesn't mean you aren't good Rangers. It's just that you're not as cool or as experienced or as powerful or as traveled as we are. Which again is supported by the previously stated comparison by the author of the Omegas as being college kids versus the MMPRs as high school hometowners. It's just so unfair to Aisha, Rocky, and Adam, both as Rangers and as characters. You can't give us 3 new Rangers with the point of their introduction story that they're just as capable and important as the originals, while also giving the originals they're replacing these amazing, cool new powers and amazing new mission that's presented as far beyond the scope of what the replacements are doing. It's just contradictory to the core, because you're still framing the new guys as inferior to the originals, even if it's not in context of who's wearing the MMPR suit. And that's especially obvious when you look at the Go-Go Power Rangers side of the Necessary Evil arc. Rather than giving the Stone Canyon trio focus via actually introducing these 3 fresh new characters, or expanding on their backstories in Stone Canyon, we spend a majority of the event on the origins of the modern Omegas, while Adam, Aisha, and Rocky's introduction gets reduced to a panel at the end of one issue, and then they're just Rangers in the next and final issue of Go-Go Power Rangers, saying we should just watch the show if we want to see who the heck these people are and why they were chosen to be Rangers in the first place. The event on the Go-Go Power Rangers side is 12 issues long, by the way, with 2 filler issues serving as breaks in the main story. So that's plenty of time and space that they could have dedicated the Stone Canyon trio rather than Bulk and Skull or Rita's side adventures, or 2 whole issues dedicated to Jason getting his memories of Shattered Grid back. They don't even get those cute little likes/dislikes narrative boxes that all the originals, minus Tommy, got during their Go-Go Power Rangers intros. Which, while, yeah, that might seem like a little nitpick, it's just adding on to the implication that the books don't really care about who these guys are outside of suit filler, even though part of the point of Go-Go Power Rangers' existence as a book was to show who the MMPRs were outside of the suits. Especially when, by the time the 2016 series finishes, the only member of the trio who really gets to dive into their personal life and family is Rocky, with Aisha just getting occasional hints of her family life, and only really done to serve other characters such as her future love interest Matt, and Adam getting nothing. He literally got nothing. It's actually kind of impressive at how hard the book swerved against giving Adam any sort of focus at every opportunity. When he did actually get focus, it was an alternate version of him that died horribly. And as I alluded to earlier, the same thing happens to White Ranger Tommy, who, besides joining Zed in the category of characters that constantly had to be beaten down to prove how strong the new villain or how strong the new Ranger is, can barely go a storyline without the books reminding us that Jason is actually the true leader. And whenever Jason comes back, the books automatically defer to Jason as the leader, or at the very least largely dismiss Tommy's thoughts and feelings in favor of Jason's. One of the most infuriating scenes in the Necessary Evil event is Tommy and Jason having a sparring session after the MMPRs discover the truth about the Omegas via the Omegas returning to Earth to ask for help in the wake of Kia's betrayal. And Tommy is very clearly using the session to vent his hurt feelings to Jason. Tommy's feelings specifically had been built up for a while, such as back in Go-Go Power Rangers with him calling out Jason and company for leaving the MMPRs when they were needed the most, now with the, supposedly, more powerful Zed around, and pointing out how they didn't even have the decency to tell the team the decision to leave to their faces, instead having to learn they were leaving from a news report. So now, this scene could serve as an emotional catharsis to the resentment and hurt being built up in Tommy for so long. However, the scene doesn't do that. It gives emotional catharsis, alright, but not to Tommy, but to Jason. Instead of meeting Tommy's hurt with an apology or even acknowledging his feelings as valid, Jason turns it around by acting like Tommy was the unreasonable one for not considering Jason's feelings, acting like this was such a difficult thing for him to do, when really the Omegas had been treating this work upgrade like the thing they were always meant to be doing, and having no problem with taking control of the MMPR's mission and lifestyle. Jason treats this like something he had no choice over, when really the only thing out of his control was having to keep his identity secret. Everything else, including choosing to take up the Omega mantle in the first place, was all on him, Zach, and Trini. The intention might have been to present both boys on equal ground, but Jason gets the last punch, the last word, and ends the scene walking away, clearly framing him as the correct one in the argument, when Tommy objectively was the most hurt here. On the flip side, remember when Matt was upset about the MMPRs keeping secrets from him and the story presented his case as the most correct and victimized? Yeah. And this comes after a scene where Jason wonders if he really did make a mistake in going to Earth and beating the MMPR's villains for them. The setup feels like it's going to have Jason acknowledge his part in Tommy's hurt feelings and apologize, but for some reason the book doesn't land with it in favor of this weird framing of Tommy being hurtful to Jason. And this isn't a case of, oh well, this was just a one-time thing. They'll acknowledge the Omegas did wrong or present Tommy as valid eventually, because they don't. Unless you count Jason and Tommy combining Zords at the end, like this is supposed to represent them coming together or something, without, actually having Jason apologize or even having a real conversation with him that doesn't involve physical violence. This is a recurring problem throughout the Omega stories, to the point where I literally have a collection of all the times Jason goes, "Sorry, I guess, but you're the wrong one here, actually." The books just constantly have the Omegas do these big epic takedowns of Tommy's concerns over actions such as them seemingly ditching Earth when they have new threats like Zed to worry about, or keeping secrets over their identities, or stealing Draken and going off into the unknown with him, which are always framed as the Omegas being right simply because they always get the last word in the scene. Tommy can't even point out the risks of running off with Draken, his evil alternate universe counterpart who had murdered him and nearly ended existence in a previous timeline, something the Omegas know because they had their memories of that timeline restored, without getting shut down by Trini's epic knowledge of the dangers of the universe, and the rest of the MMPRs insisting it's fine because the Omegas will just save the universe. The books just keep insisting on these weak in-universe justifications, or insist the Omegas are simply the cooler, more powerful ones for doing things on their own, versus how Tommy defers to Zordon and Zordon's rules, which are now actually super restrictive and bad for some reason, and the Omegas automatically know more than anyone else because they travel in space. Much like how the books refuse to let the Stone Canyon Trio really grow as Rangers, the books barely let Tommy grow into his role as leader, which gets especially frustrating when you think about how in the original show, the Stone Canyon Trio are Rangers and Tommy is a leader far longer than the original three are. Heck, the MMPR V2 team exists far longer than the original MMPR team in these comics. Now, I'm not saying it had to end up this way, nor am I even writing off the concept of the Omegas and weaving them back into the MMPR storyline entirely. It wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world to go back to the Omegas occasionally, but that's the key word we're missing here. Occasionally. And at the very least, the Omegas should not have been introduced in the same event as Aisha, Rocky, and Adam. The trio should have gotten an arc or two to themselves to introduce them to the audience and establish themselves as Rangers, and then we get the twist that Jason, Zach, and Trini have been Omegas this entire time. Because this is not the Omega series. This is the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series. Or at least, it's supposed to be. While the continued lack of development for the MMPR V2 team after Necessary Evil is also partly because of the addition of Green Ranger Matt, who again got far more focus on one-on-one development than the Stone Canyon Trio, and interfered with Tommy's development because of how much of Tommy's story got devolved to, he's just jealous of Matt and has to be nice to Matt, but I have an entirely different video on that. A lot of that is because the main storylines of the books in general became mostly centered on the Omegas, or at the very least the Omegas' conflicts, and thus their development took priority. The next two events in the series after the Omega's introduction, while featuring both teams, especially when the books split into two to have one focus on the MMPRs while the others focus on the Omegas, the events clearly have a bias in which team actually moves the plot forward and is acknowledged by the narrative in a meaningful way, to the point where both events close out on the Omegas while the MMPRs exist more as backup to their fights before getting shuffled off into the background themselves so the Omegas can get all the personal resolution. The first of these events is the Ultimate Power / Eltarian War event. It turns out Kia killing the Blue Emissary unleashed a being called an MP-Real, which causes a domino effect of the red and yellow emissaries also dying and their own MP-Reals getting unleashed under the command of Zordon's old boss Zartus, controlling them through something called a Celestial Shard. I can't really explain this stuff more deeply because frankly the whole deal with the MP-Reals is barely explained beyond being called the emissaries' shadows, and relies on a backstory that gets retconned by the Power Rangers Universe miniseries anyway. The MP-Reals are going around destroying entire planets they / Zartus consider unworthy, aka don't comply to Eltar's regime because Eltar is a planet of fascists now. And the Omegas decide Zordon isn't doing enough to help after a single day of filling him in on the situation, so they take matters into their own hands through actions like busting Draken out of jail, who, is here too, by the way, and chasing down the MP-Reals from planet to planet with mixed success. However, it's eventually revealed that Draken was actually working with the MP-Reals and leaves the Omegas to die after an encounter with one of them. Though out of some fondness he's developed for them over the course of the journey, he leaves them with a tracker so Yale, given the Omega Blue morpher by the ghost of the Blue Emissary, can save them. There's a giant fight on Earth between the MMPRs, the Omegas, the Eltarians, the MP-Reals, and Draken until they win thanks to the Blue Emissary reviving via their MP-Reel dying and landing the finishing blow. Going along with the framing of the Omegas as being the next level of Rangers compared to the MMPRs, there's an underlying theme in this event, in particular of the Omegas being the ones having to make grown-up decisions and figuring out what to do next because their mentor, the Blue Emissary, is dead, compared to the MMPRs who are still under the guidance of Zordon with the mission to protect Earth. The Omegas bust Draken out of prison because he supposedly has information against the MP-Reals against Zordon's wishes. When Zordon notifies SPD about what the Omegas have done and subsequently arrest them, they have to team up with known villains Ecliptor and Nostronema to escape SPD's clutches. They have to decide if it's worth saving a planet targeted by the MP-Reals when said planet is populated by known colonizers and slavers that outright sell sapient creatures in their street markets. In the long run, they justify these actions by them being what's necessary to be done to stop the greater evil of the MP-Reals. A necessary evil, you could say. It's a theme that was kind of starting in Necessary Evil, where the Omegas take down Zed in infringement of Zordon's don't escalate a fight against the enemy rule, but it felt somewhat justified at the time by the Omegas technically not having to follow Zordon's rules anymore, and the moment where Zordon points out how what they did was a disservice to the development of the MMPRs helped balance things out a bit. Even if the thought never went further than that, in fact the scene right after it has Tommy apologize for Zordon's words. But still, the potential for Zordon being right was there, it just never really came to pass. But overall, there's clearly a desire here to tell more mature and grown-up stories with the Omegas, stories that aren't as clear-cut as the Rangers are good and blow up the monsters who are evil. And I don't even need to analyze the stories that deeply to know that, because at every possible opportunity you have the Omegas look into the camera and say, wow, what we did was bad, but we're the good guys. Isn't that crazy? As well as the constant discussion of how the Omegas are dealing with the bigger universe on their own terms rather than just Earth under Zordon's rules. But the problem here is no matter how much the books have the Omegas commit morally gray acts, at the end of the day, all their actions are excused, either through the books framing what they did as correct no matter what, or just simply not bringing up the consequences of their actions or rewriting what had been previously established to support their point of view. The Omegas were right in freeing Draken because eventually he saved them and then helped in the final battle. But we won't point out that he now has all his powers back, his own spaceship, and is free to do whatever he wants, something Tommy and Zordon were afraid would happen in the first place. He has the potential to be good now, and the Charge to 100 event right afterwards acts like Jason being focused on trying to hunt down Draken and catch him again was a bad thing because he was focused too much on one thing instead of the bigger picture or whatever. We won't discuss the Omegas freeing Astronema, known heir to Dark Spectre and Ranger Killer, and an SPD officer being killed in the process. They basically treat that arc as if it never happened. In fact, an issue in the next event will have G mention that SPD will come to save Haven to pick up a criminal they had captured. So I guess SPD is just very forgiving of the whole Dark Spectre's heir breakout and murder of an officer thing. Suddenly we'll ignore how early in the storyline Zordon did believe in the threat of the MP-Reals, with some side stories showing that he had contacted the Phantom Ranger and sent him to investigate the affected areas. will just suddenly write it so that Zordon never believed in the MP reels at all and the Phantom Ranger never shows up in the final battle, nor is he mentioned in the main series at all. In fact, there's a scene where Kim gives Zordon an epic takedown on how he's isolated their allies amongst Prometheus and the Omegas. Options previously seen or mentioned, like the Alien Rangers or Phantom Ranger, are not brought up at all. And thus he has to personally apologize and give his blessing to the Omegas, referring to Jason and Trini specifically as his children, and Jason being the true leader everyone respects. Even after a scene where Jason tells Kim to stop bringing up Zordon after everyone thought he had been killed. Zordon's guidance throughout the storyline gets consistently portrayed as flawed and his judgment being clouded by his Eltarian values, with Jason defending his decision to take Draken with, "Your way is not the only way, Zordon. Perhaps you've been on Earth so long you can't see that anymore," and his rules as too restrictive and preventing the Rangers from doing as much good as they can. But it's something that isn't really supported by the surrounding text at all. Instead, just, again, deliberately written after the fact to support the Omega's point of view. Zordon's rules, at the end of the day, just amount to preventing the Rangers from doing whatever they want with the magical, all-powerful alien weapons and giant robots they've been given, which is a very justified and necessary precaution. The books just decide to not justify these rules by not properly exploring the downsides of breaking these rules. This is something more discussed with Green Ranger and Matt, but is still relevant to the Omega side due to the overall idea that they're better off without a mentor telling them what to do. And with the idea that Zordon considered Eltar the pinnacle of society and let that cloud his judgment, considering Zordon never brings up Eltarian values outside of wistful nostalgia for a time when he wasn't, stuck in a tube, it just feels like putting words into Zordon's mouth for him to later say he didn't believe in the MP reels or was blind to Eltar's flaws, especially when his actions in the book defy that claim. When Zartus and his army do arrive on Earth and start staking their claim, to the point of demanding Zordon hand over the power coins, he turns against them immediately, calling himself Zordon of Earth, and nearly dies for it via Zartus smashing his tube. Honestly, his willingness to work with the Eltarians beforehand just comes from being happy to see his old friend again, and him having actual information on the MP reels, not a belief that Eltar knows best in how to operate a society. Zordon's whole philosophy is wanting to protect Earth but not influence its societal development, something that's a major point of conflict in previous arcs discussing the Rangers wanting to tell their families what's up with them, or Jason wanting to find treatment for his ailing father, which is the complete opposite of Eltar's fascist conquering ways. Zordon's most oppressive action towards the Omegas in the story is not wanting them to take Draken, getting angry enough to notify SPD against them when they do it anyway, but it's shown that before the Omegas decide to bust in and break Draken out, he had been reconsidering his position and expressed a desire to Alpha to come to a compromise with them the next day. And then they come in and steal Draken and break Alpha in the process. So, if the Omegas are going to decide to run around with someone that they know had previously murdered their friend and nearly caused the end of existence based on nothing but him saying, "Oh yeah, I saw an emissary get killed by one of those MP rail things," honestly, after not even a day of negotiating, I'd be pretty pissed at them too. Sorry guys. No, Zordon was right about that. By and large, the Omegas were the starting point of everything having gone wrong in this event, but the Morphing Grid deity personally excuses them, says they did their best, just made some mistakes, and that they don't need a mentor anymore. This was just their new beginning. The final MP reel is unleashed, and the Yellow Emissary dies because the Omegas don't want to listen to Zordon and Tommy's warnings about taking Draken. Because Draken was working with the MP reels the whole time. But they don't need a mentor, they did their best. Actually, Zordon and Tommy were unreasonable about not wanting Draken to go, because he maybe kind of helped them out sometimes and left them the possibility to be found after stranding them on a melted planet with no resources, and with no guarantee that someone would have found them before they died. That's not telling deeper and more mature stories with the Omegas. It's the complete opposite, because you're literally showing us that they can do anything, even actions that lead to their friends getting hurt and people dying. But they're always going to be the heroes in the end, and it was always actually someone else's fault, or just very easy to blow off as simple mistakes. And then to top it all off, these resolutions with the Omegas is how the event ends, with none of that same time and space and validation gone to the MMPRs. Outside of Billy, the only MMPR to really get anything substantial in the Zordon/Eltarian plot in the first place, further hammering home that the Omegas were the central Rangers in this storyline, something that will unfortunately get repeated in the next event. So the second major storyline is the Charge to 100 event, which appropriately is meant to lead up to and celebrate the 100th issue of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series. The MMPR side is composed of one storyline where the MMPRs find a new command center to replace the one destroyed in Eltarian War, and then another where Kim accidentally summons a bunch of villain cameos from across the series in an attempt to strengthen themselves against future threats. The two storylines sound pretty disconnected, and they pretty much are, but they have a slim connecting thread when the storyline over in the Power Rangers side busts in. Andros gets the idea to use the Omegas, now basically operating as freelance cops now that they're effectively missionless, to find the legendary gold Omega Morpher that could have the power to bring Zane back to life from his coma. He breaks it out of the Omega's big dumpster safe, but putting it on Zane unleashes the evil Death Ranger spirit, who goes on to kill the Omegas for their zombie army, and Jason becomes their new primary host. In the big number 100 issue, it all comes together into a big battle where the MMPRs, Andros, and the Safe Haven residents have to band together to fight against the Death Ranger, ultimately ending with Jason landing the final blow, freeing him from the Death Ranger's possession, but at the cost of his connection to the morphing grid, so he has to leave the Omegas. So first of all, I think I have to repeat that the 100th issue of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series is centered on an Omega Rangers villain, and has to be solved by the conflict started on the Omega's side. And then just like Eltarian War, the final pages mostly focus on resolution for the Omega's narratives. Specifically, Jason's narrative, as Zack and Trini's narrative of raising the alien kid journey kind of felt more like an excuse to keep them out of the more important Andros and Jason side. When this issue came out, I saw people call the final issue of the Mighty Morphin side a better number 100 than this, and I have to agree, because while it was mostly centered on Kim, it actually felt like it mattered to the MMPRs as a whole, giving a glimpse at how their legacy would last into the future versus their beginnings here with deciding on their team name together. To contrast how in the actual 100 issue, the Mighty Morphin team existed to back up the Omegas in cleaning up their mess and then fade back into the background once the Death Ranger is defeated, because they have no idea who Andros is, who this journey person is, and why we should be sad that they died, and obviously only Zack and Trini could possibly comfort Jason over losing his powers. That's never something that happened to anyone on the Mighty Morphin team. Pretty much everything major here is done to service Jason. His own mother, that we as readers have never seen before outside of maybe 2 quick background appearances, dies out of nowhere due to a freak health complication in a textbook fridging situation. When Andros takes Jason through the morphing grid to find Death Ranger in this weird mindscape type thing, there's a montage of scenes from previous arcs, but of course they're all scenes that have Jason as a central character. Jason literally gets to mansplain tragedy to the victim of interplanetary genocide, and for some reason the story doesn't have Jason fall victim to possession via accepting Death Ranger's offer of using their power to bring back his mother. He refuses their offer, which is where we see the whole mansplaining tragedy of the genocide victim, and gets possessed through a sneak attack. Also, hey, Andros doing bad things in the name of good, teaming up with someone clearly evil in the name of helping others, that was sure the entire setup for the Omega stories, wasn't it? It so weirdly sets up Jason as the instigator, but at the same time, he's above it all. He's the main character, but he has no stakes in the central conflict. There's no tension in the finale where Death Ranger makes a vision of Jason's mother to tempt him into staying as their primary host, because we've already seen Jason reject Death Ranger's offer to bring back his mother. Jason doesn't even lose the powers of his own volition here, which could have been a way to make it clear he learned something from this event. He gets forcefully cut off from the grid, and at the same time, Trini and Zack's dialogue is very, very clearly alluding to how this isn't the end of Jason's Ranger career, straight up referring to it as a break, further softening the blow. Besides wishing that Jason could have actually been portrayed as fallible, my most steadfast opinion of this event is that it should have ended with all of the Omegas retiring and not just Jason. Be it through solidarity with him, they also get cut off from the powers to stop Death Ranger's possession, or, in my most ideal case, they realize they're not the right ones for the job anymore and the various Safe Haven civilians take up the powers as a new generation. Heck, one of the bonus stories in the deluxe edition hardcovers has Blue Emissary watching over the kids in Safe Haven and waxing poetic about how the legacy of Power Rangers will live on through them. As I discussed more in my Death Ranger video, it's pointed out by Death Ranger themselves that the Omegas have continuously failed in their attempts to save the universe by making things worse instead. The setup was there for them all to go, but obviously this doesn't happen because A, that would imply the Omegas ever did anything wrong, and B, we just can't let go of Jason, Zack, and Trini. In the end, it's obvious that the event was only meant as a send-off for Jason, something that wouldn't really come to pass as intended, because while this event says Jason and his dad are leaving Angel Grove entirely to find better help for his dad's poor health, the next arc, Recharged, will just have Jason still in Angel Grove. And the MMPRs were also there this whole time, I guess. Man, even though I would say Eltarian War was the worst written if I had to compare the two, at least there was an attempt to give the MMPR some relevance to the plot, even if I didn't totally agree with the decisions being made, and they could have gotten way more by far. But here they were literally just additional bodies in the fight, or just supplying plot convenience devices, which again is such an insult for what's supposed to be their 100th issue. The final event in the series, and thus the final storyline for the Omegas, doesn't quite feature the Omegas to the extent that the first 3 series did, and that's probably due to the fact that we now had a new author, as well as how the event was simply juggling too much for Omegas to get that much focus, besides being additional bodies in the Ranger army. Though I will take a moment and be annoyed that the event gives Jason, Zack, and Trini prominent roles in the event, including a big reunion as if they've been separated for years, versus how Rocky and Adam spend the entire event corrupted. And while Aisha worries about them, her time is mostly spent with her new love interest, Matt, and the trio never have a similar reunion after Rocky and Adam are freed from the corruption. Even by the end of the series, the Omegas were still featured more prominently than the actual full MMPR team. In terms of specific arcs, the most noteworthy ones they get are Jason and Trini adjusting to their new roles as civilian and leader respectively, though in the latter's case, sometimes it felt like the real major priority was her new romance with Zack. Trini becoming Red is something I am neutral on, and I feel the whole fandom was when it happened. While her becoming leader had been very clearly foreshadowed to a few times in previous storylines, the actual changing of the guard happens off-screen, so we don't see the decision discussed, which I think in the end hurt the impact, and seemed to mostly happen for bragging rights of Trini becoming a Red Ranger. Like, don't get me wrong, it's awesome that Trini could be a Red Ranger, but as people pointed out when the change happened, why couldn't Trini have just been a yellow leader? Why did they go through the complication of playing musical chairs with the powers when it would have just been simpler to just give Kevor the morpher that didn't have a user? It's like if when we went back to the Solar Rangers, Ari had to give up her purple powers and take up red to be considered the leader of her new team. And like not showing the decision to make Trini leader, not showing the team choosing Kevor to take the powers makes his inclusion feel less, he deserves these powers over anyone else, and more, well, Journey's dead and Archon's old, so I guess he's the only safe haven character left. But I guess it doesn't really matter since Kevor unfortunately doesn't get as much time to shine as a Ranger, since his Ranger career starts in an event that struggled to balance all the characters it brings in at the jump, and a random alien OC kid that we just met last arc was very clearly not on the list of high priorities. There's a brief thing where he worries if he's capable enough as a Ranger and seems to be mentored by Zack, but he and Yale get shuffled off to captured and corrupted status halfway through, and we only get a very small background event of him and Zack reuniting in the last few pages when the infection is purged. Funnily enough, there was some confusion over Kevor's status at first, as number 116 shows him escaping a battle with the other Rangers, but after a few issues of radio silence, they're suddenly talking about how he was captured, supposedly in said battle, which of course is an honest mistake, but it really goes to show how inconsequential his character was, especially since, despite the build-up in the early days of Zack and Kevor having some kind of mentorship thing going on, Zack himself barely talks about Kevor at all, except to be like, I think we're doing fine, just the two of us, when Trini vents her leader woes to him, because we have to keep developing this new romance. Like, yeah, I get the point is we're supposed to see Zack as kind and supportive to Trini during her moments of worry because romance and stuff, but it just comes off like now that Kevor's gone, Zack's primary role is to be Trini's boyfriend over anything else, even over the kid whom he supposedly was very close to and realistically should be extremely worried over. So out of all these events, the Necessary Evil era is when the Omegas actually felt the most relevant and interesting because it felt like there was an actual purpose to their existence. I like the idea of them being a Shattered Grid cleanup crew as a discussion of the fallout of that event, and I'm not going to act like I'm immune to the novelty of the concept of Jason, Zack, and Trini not getting tossed to Switzerland just because that's what happened on the show. But the problem is, as the years went by, it felt like the only purpose to them sticking around was to keep the comics clinging to Season 1 elements, even when we should be progressing farther along into Season 2 or even Season 3's timeline, especially when the events would offer very clear outs for the Omegas to retire and hand the powers off to the 20 million incidental characters on Safe Haven. They could have chosen to stop after the cracks were fixed, something they do briefly discuss as an option for them, but they don't because, MP reels, they could have chosen to stop after Eltarian War out of shame over how they literally made everything worse. But this never happens because Blue tells them they're the most special guys ever and should keep being Omegas. Zack and Trini could have have retired alongside Jason, either in solidarity or because they simply don't want to be Rangers anymore because they got murdered and then possessed. But they don't, because we want to show off that Trini is red now. And all in all, they can't retire because we want to keep the easy sales of the original 6 still being part of the main cast, even though it's been years since Rocky, Adam, and Aisha showed up, and they should be way higher priority than they are now. But instead, we'll end the series as barely footnotes because we had 3 events that could have been used to flesh them out. But instead, the events were all about the Omegas and the Omegas' problems, and the one that wasn't still heavily featured Jason, Zach, and Trini over Adam, Rocky, and Aisha. But I think the most frustrating thing about the Omegas, besides how much they hurt the other characters in the book's insistence of keeping them front and center, is that the Omegas push this idea of how being a Ranger is the only way for a Ranger to do good. Back in the early days of the comics, they were clearly prepping for the day Jason, Zach, and Trini would have to leave, with Trini outright saying to Tommy that being a Ranger isn't the only way to help people and maybe would have wanted to become a doctor like her father. Zach talks to Zordon about wanting to do more for the world, and during a period where Rita has left the moon and thus left the Earth alone, notes that he enjoys being able to help with more mundane disasters such as tornadoes and traffic pileups. Despite what you might think, the franchise itself was always very insistent on how Ranger powers come secondary to the power a normal citizen can do. Rangers themselves notably only come to exist when there's an active threat approaching their planet or town or whatever. Jason, Zach, and Trini going to a peace conference isn't glamorous, and came from an out-of-universe instance of greed screwing over the actors, but the message was still there, something that Pink also addresses with Trini and Zach finding purpose helping out in Switzerland, and only becoming Rangers again because it was necessary to help Kim. But now suddenly, blasting around the galaxy doing Ranger stuff like freelance police is the only way these guys want to help. Like, it's the only valid way for them to help those less fortunate. You have Jason saying that there are thousands of planets out there that need the Omega Rangers, but have no idea we're here, and broadcasting their intentions to protect people or throw them in dumpsters. Something that worked so well back in Necessary Evil, didn't it? Darkest Hour tries to acknowledge this, with Jason having lost his powers and thus trying to find his place in the world as a civilian, but it doesn't hit when he's still, in essence, doing Ranger stuff, like training Promethea's army and fighting in the battles and being a confidant/leader to the Rangers. He just isn't morphing. That's cheating. And besides, the books aren't exactly subtle about how he'll eventually go on to become Gold Zeo Ranger anyway. And really, despite the books insisting that they're just too awesome and powerful to retire, the Omegas barely even save the day by themselves if we're being honest here. In practically every major storyline featuring them, they have to get bailed out by someone, whether it's the MMPRs or the side characters. Ranger Slayer and the Solar Rangers instantly solve the problem with the Empowered, the mission that was pitched as going to take years to complete with their whole find them and pick them up and stick them in quarantine strategy. And this supposedly fixed the cracks. Maybe. It's honestly pretty vague. Their cracks are just randomly declared fixed. The MMPRs and Andros have to save them when they get zombified. Blue's ghost made Yale a Ranger, and Yale in turn saves the stranded Omegas. Blue creates their big Omega Ultrazord in the final fight of Eltarian War, which quickly gets destroyed. So Blue and the White Tiger/Dragon Zord combination destroy the final MP-Reels. And this is supposed to be a battle that results in the Blue Emissary saying the Omegas don't need a mentor anymore? Dude, you kept saving them all event and you're supposed to be dead. Zach literally makes a joke about how they had the Omega Ultrazord for 5 seconds before it got broken. Going along with that, it's also annoying how despite barely ever saving the day by themselves, the Omegas or the MMPRs will talk about an Omega thing like it's just the absolute coolest thing in the world and way better than their MMPR stuff. You'll have Zach like, wow, these commas are so much better than my axe, or do some fancy team move and be like, eat your heart out, Power Blaster. Or when the Omegazords combine, the MMPRs will be like, now that's a Megazord. And it's like, this is what I mean by how the books say they're not comparing the two teams when they clearly are. When you have the characters looking into the camera and saying, wow, isn't this Omega thing just so much cooler than the MMPR thing? But also, come on, why are we lying and saying an axe gun isn't the greatest idea for a weapon ever? Come on! This is getting more petty than analytical, but I've been reading about these guys for years and I'm tired. This video was a long time coming, kind of like my Matt video, because like Matt, the Omegas were an original concept that basically took over the books and went on indefinitely despite the multiple clear exits they could have taken, eventually just kinda ending with the series despite how this would contradict the show's timeline. Yes, the comics are an alternate universe from the show, but the comics were very clearly made to follow what the show had established, though admittedly how much depended on the author. Even the Omega's existence only happens because of what the show previously established, which is that Jason, Zach, and Trini leave and be replaced by Rocky, Adam, and Aisha. It's just that the exact circumstances of them leaving are what's different. Back in the early days of the comics, I saw people theorize that the series would take different paths, like not having the actors leave at all, or Jason would get the White Ranger powers, etc. So much like how we have no idea what would happen with Matt and the Dragon Coin, as the show establishes Tommy gets all his powers back eventually, somehow, we have no idea what happens with the Omegas, as the show will establish in Once and Always that Trini and Zach obviously were not Omegas, and also got their MMPR powers back. They also were not a romantic couple. They're just left wide open, which benefits fanfiction, I guess, but also just kind of leaves you unsatisfied. Especially since, again, like Matt, by the end of the run, it doesn't feel like the Omegas really added anything meaningful to the series beyond fan service of Jason, Zach, and Trini getting to stay as Rangers and showing off how much cooler they are than their replacements. They could have been a vehicle for some genuinely good discussion. There was something there to discuss the Rangers thinking they were only useful if they had powers. There was something there to discuss the Omegas ditching their lives and responsibilities on Earth for the perfect paradise that is Safe Haven. Back in the Charge to 100 event, I literally thought that was where it was going with Jason and his dad, with Jason's dad needing care, but Jason being happy to ignore that in favor of the, again, perfect paradise that is Safe Haven, where he literally talks about how they have none of their responsibilities that they have on Earth. But these downsides to the trio perpetually staying as Rangers never gets brought up, and by the end, the fandom seemed to treat the Omegas as just the next step for retired MMPRs that don't become Zeo Rangers, because the comics themselves treated them like that. For instance, Kim eventually becoming an Omega was genuinely a theory I would see frequently. And while cool at first, it just loses steam very quickly because it wasn't anything really substantial. It was all flash and no substance. And it really wasn't worth the loss of the MMPRs not being the stars of their own book anymore, leaving behind characters like Rocky, Adam, or Aisha to do little except prop up these original concepts as infallible, despite causing legitimate harm to them and others, and just in general being extremely unlikable at times without getting called out for it. Good job, guys, for proving that you're worthy of being Rangers. Now get out of here and look at how cool the Omegas are. They can beat Zed. Can you beat Zed? Oh wow, look, they have a tiger on their team. Do you have a tiger on your team? I thought not. So this got way too long. If you're still here, thank you a lot. Thank you for listening to me ramble. Next video should hopefully be a little more positive, as Matt and the Omegas were my probably most hated concepts of the comics, and I think I might finally be done talking about them. Hey, it's Chipster from the future, or Chipster from the editing stage. So I know I just said that this was going to be the end of Omega hate, but that was back when this video originally had a big section on Kia and Yale, which I ended up cutting because it didn't really fit with the rest of the video, and I kind of realized I had more to say just on the subject of Kia and she deserved her own video rather than just getting squashed into this one. So, more Omega ranting will come soon. See you then. So, if you like this video, thanks for listening, and my Ko-fi link is in the comments if you'd like to give me a tip. Thank you, and goodbye.